I finally found out today how I get selected for this program. You know, they had somebody else that was scheduled for this period, but they canceled out at the last minute, and General Light went out looking for somebody, and he decided he was going to get the most intelligent person he could find to make the presentation. Well, he was refused. So, and he said, well, if I can't have the most intelligent, I'll get the very best speaker that I can find. Again, he was refused. And then he had to ponder this for quite a while, but then, he said, if I can't have the most intelligent, the very best speaker, I want the handsomest guy that I can find. Well, I accepted. I just didn't have a heart to turn him down 3 times in a row. This is a story of the rescue at Cam Duck, which resulted in the award of the Medal of Honor. I was commander of a detachment at Da Nang Air Base. We had 8 C-123s. Give me the first slide, please. This is C-123, and it's an old clunker. It was designed during World War II, and the purpose was to land tanks and light artillery pieces behind the line during the invasion of Europe. Well, they didn't make enough of them, and they didn't have people trained so that they could be used during World War II. So they were just sitting out in the ramp and doing nothing. And finally, the Army Air Corps, which I was in at the time, decided they needed a light transport. So they hung 2 R-2800 engines on these things, 2,500 horsepower each, and made it a light transport. Well, it worked out all right, and because it was flying mainly off of improved runways with long runways of about 5,000-6,000 feet. And so it worked out okay. And they were used considerably in the States, and some were used overseas. And when the Vietnam War came along, they decided to use this primarily in Vietnam because it had rather short takeoff and landing capabilities. And so they were using them over there, and the problem was that the high temperatures made it kind of dangerous to use on short strips, because we had a lot of strips that was only 2,000 feet long. And one that I can remember was the Hue Citadel was only 1,700 feet long. Now that would pucker you up, I'll tell you. We could get on the ground all right, but then getting off with a load would be a challenge. Anyway, 12th of May, 1968 was this. It was just beginning to get to be the dry season in North Vietnam, and so nothing really unusual about it, except for the fact that it was Mother's Day. It was I was scheduled to get a flight check that day, and so everything was going very well. One thing about this airplane, though, that when they found out that it was kind of marginal in operating off of short strips, especially on takeoff, they added two jet engines, one on each side. I had 2,800 pounds of thrust, and that really made it a lifesaver. So anyway, that was the type of airplane we were using at that time. It was called a K model, and so we took off about 6 o'clock in the morning, going out for a standard run up and down the coast, and this was my flight check it was semi-annual flight check that I was getting. Next slide, please. This guy on the right over here, Major Jesse Campbell, is a flight check pilot. The guy on the left is Manson Grubbs. He's the load master. And next slide, please. And here you see Edward Trejo. He's getting an award for some other action that he was in. And it required this number of crew members because that's an old clunker and it didn't have any of the modern conveniences that present-day transports have. So anyway, we're going up and down the coast. Our northernmost city was Dong Ha, just below the DMZ, about 3 miles, and we were hauling supplies in to them. And then there's another one down south. It was the limit of our area of operation called Quinyon. Well, we got up to Dong Ha and made our delivery, and we were hopping airfield to airfield on the way back, and got down to Chulai, which is Marine base just southeast of Da Nang, and checked in with the airlift control element, and they said, "You're being recalled. I want you to go back to Da Nang." Okay, so we went back to Da Nang, and they told us they wanted us to do a special mission, that they had an emergency over at Camp Duck. And so we went in for an intelligence briefing, and we seldom had a intelligence briefing for routine operations. But anyway, we went in and they briefed it that Camp Duck was being overrun by some 6,000 North Vietnamese troops. And there was a total of about 1,700 people at Camp Duck, of which about almost 500 or so were dependents of the South Vietnamese soldiers. I want to show you where that is. Next slide, please. You may be able to read. I can't point it out to you, but somewhere right in here, you see a little sign that says Camp Duck. Camp Duck is over next to the river, right on the border of Laos. The reason it's there in the first place was to gather intelligence about movement of North Vietnamese troops and supplies up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, going down into South Vietnam. Well, they had would you give me the next slide, please? You can see up here at the top, this is the Camp Duck airfield, and down here at the bottom, there's a satellite base called Nak Tavac. And Nak Tavac is the one that's doing the primarily spying against the movement of supplies and people up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That area had, other than gathering intelligence, had very little military significance. The The only thing that's significant about it is that the base is, well, I'll get into that in a minute. So we were briefed to go down and to help evacuate Cam Duck. Ed Trejo and Manson Grubbs drew out automatic rifles and clips of ammunition. Jesse Campbell and I filled our pockets with ammunition for our service revolvers, and we drew flak vest for protection. Well, I drew 2 flak vests. I put one on and I sat on the other one because I knew what part of my anatomy I wanted to protect the most. So at any rate, we got a briefing, got refueled, and headed down to Cam Duck. When we got down there, we checked in with the Airborne Command Post, and the Airborne Command Post gave us instructions to go to the southwest of the field and orbit at 9,000 feet, and they'd give us a call when they were ready for us. Well, I did that and went down and started my orbit. And I'm going to leave you in orbit there for a while, and I want to go back and tell you what has happened up until about that time. I think it was Thursday the 9th of May that Noctavac down in the southern part had sent out a scouting party, and they had made contact with a North Vietnamese patrol, and they got into a firefight. Well, during the firefight, there was one of the North Vietnamese soldiers that got captured and brought back into Noctavac, and during the questioning, he had said that they had had instructions that they were going to overrun Cam Duck within the next 2 or 3 days. So the commander there, who was, by the way, happened to be an Australian, decided he would withdraw his troops into Cam Duck and try to ward off the attack. In addition to the satellite base, there was a detachment of Marines there that had a fire base that they put out harassing fire throughout the jungle area. As they started to retreat and go back into Cam Duck, they got ambushed and driven back into Noctavac. At that point, the Australian commander decided that he would withdraw to the south and get up on top of the hill and call for helicopters to lift them out of there. While he was en route back to the south, they decided, we still have our artillery pieces there that are still operational, so they sent a detachment of Marines back to plant thermite bombs in the breaches to make them unusable. Well, the Marines went back and they did destroy the guns, but they all got captured and later executed. By the way, the remains of those were recovered, brought back to the United States, and those that they could identify, they were sent back to their hometowns for interment. The others that they could not identify were buried in a mass grave at Arlington. Well, when Captain White, the commander at Nukhtavak got back to Kamduk, he reported what was happening, and the commander at Kamduk decided that he had better call in for reinforcements. So he sent an emergency communications down to Saigon, and in the next day they sent a detachment. Actually, they sent a battalion of soldiers in that brought the strength up to around 1,200 Americans and South Vietnamese troops together. Actually, there was little significance to this battle militarily, except for propaganda purposes. It was very important, because what the North Vietnamese had in mind was to go in and capture as many Americans as they could, strip them down to their waist, parade them before movie cameras and still cameras, and publish that worldwide, because that was the beginning or the precursor to the peace talks that was to follow in settling the Vietnam problem. So anyway, that's why they had launched such a massive attack, was to capture as many Americans as they could. When they sent in the battalion of people, it was commanded by a Lieutenant Colonel Nelson, and he put out detachments or listening posts all around the airfield at Kamduk to keep him posted of what was going on. So during the night of the 10th of May, all of the outposts were overrun. One outpost, I think it was outpost number 2, escaped, went to the jungle, and survived there for several days on their own, even after the action had been completed at Kamduk. Well, during the day of the 11th of May, fighting increased in intensity, and more and more North Vietnamese troops were surrounding the camp and engaging in battle. Well, during the evening of the 11th to the 12th, the command center in Saigon decided they had to evacuate the camp, because they knew then that they were overwhelmed so badly they would be unable to hold it. Well, the next morning, a fog had settled in the valley, and if you could look, and you can see the mountains surrounding the camp at Kamduk. Everything was looking right down on top of the airfield and its complex. So they decided the fogs would settle in the valley, and they started the evacuation, but they started losing so many airplanes. I think they had lost 6 there pretty early in the day. 2 helicopters, one O-1, a couple of fighters were shot down. I don't know exactly what the other airplanes were, but since they were losing so many airplanes, they decided they'd better call off the evacuation But not until one of the airplanes, a C-130, that was supposed to help with the evacuation, landed. It had one of the four main tires shot out. The right wing was perforated with automatic weapons fire, and it was leaking fuel terribly. It pulled into the parking area, but it had supplies on board to resupply Cam Duck. But as soon as it got in and opened the doors, the airplane filled with dependents of the South Vietnamese soldiers, and they wouldn't get off. The pilot went out and started a run down the runway, then aborted the takeoff because the drag of that flat tire flopping around in the wheel well and the heavy load of equipment and personnel that were on board made it impossible for him to get off. So he went back to the ramp, and when he did that, it was okay for him to unload the supplies and to start chopping that flat tire off the airplane. During that time, due to the heavy loss of airplanes, they decided that they'd halt the evacuation and see if they could hold a little while longer. After a while, they got the tire cut off, and when they did that, they were going to evacuate some of the wounded, take out the pilot of the O-1 that had been shot down earlier, take out several of the crew members of one of the helicopters that had been shot down, and then they were going to evacuate and go back to Cameron Bay. They took with them also the combat control team, which was a three-man team of people sent there to control the evacuation in an orderly manner. Well, after the airplane got the tire cut off, got all of the evacuees on board, they took off and went back to Cameron Bay. At about that time, it was approaching noon on the 12th. That's when the operations center at Saigon decided, we cannot hold, we must evacuate. So they started the evacuation all over again. That's when I got my recall to go back and regas and get ready to go with the evacuation. Here I am orbiting down at 9,000 feet, and what went on during the time they started the evacuation all over again, and late that afternoon was the first C-130 that went in to pick up evacuees was hit on final approach very badly. Had all four engines were disabled. The hydraulic system was shut out. They were able to sort of splat on the runway, and they ran down the runway and ran through one of the helicopters that had been shot down and crashed in the runway, and they ran off the side, and it broke the back of the 130 because it ran through a ditch. The next airplane, a C-130 that went in, was able to pick up a load of evacuees, primarily dependents of the South Vietnamese soldiers. They had something between 150 and 200 evacuees on board. And as it took off to the northeast, it was shot down and it crashed and burned, and there were no survivors to that crash. An A-1 was shot down. Give me the next slide, please. If you would look up in the upper part, somewhere around here, you'll see a circle. That circle's an A-1. It had been the pilot of the A-1 that had been shot down. And down here on the lower part, somewhere in this area, you will see another circle with the A-1 inside the circle, and it was on fire and spinning in, and it crashed and it was lost. The pilot was, however, picked up and later rescued by a helicopter. One helicopter shot down. Next slide, please. Shot down. And this is the one that crashed in the middle of the runway, and a guy driving a front-end loader went out and tried to scrape some of that airplane off the runway to open up the runway, but the driver was killed. The front-end loader was ran away and turned over and was useless for any further purposes. So this fighting went on pretty heavy all afternoon. One of the guys that came in a C-130 picked up a load of Americans and came under heavy attack with mortars and automatic weapons fire, and he took what he could and got out of there, and had so many holes in the airplane that they figured, I don't know if they even tried to count them or not, but they got back to Cameron Bay, and some guy with a spray gun spray painted Lucky Duck on there. So that C-130 had a new name. Things went on. A friend of mine, a guy that later became a friend of mine, was flying an O-2 off to the eastern side of the airfield, saw what was happening, and so he took it upon himself to coordinate the movement or the fighters to escort the transports on their final approach to land. Well, this minimized the damage, but all of the rest of the airplanes were picking up battle damage. Not severely, but they were still picking it up. And so this went on all afternoon till the combat control team finally got to Cameron, and they were told, okay, we're starting the evacuation all over again. You get on this other C-130, you go back and control the evacuation. So they did. So the last C-130 that went in was brought the combat control team back into Cam Duck, and so they hopped off the airplane and started going through the bunkers in the building looking for survivors, and the airplane came under heavy attack while it's sitting on the ramp. The remainder of the survivors from the camp got on board that C-130, and when it came under such heavy attack, the pilot went out and and took off. But he took off, leaving the three-man combat control team on the ground at Camp Duck. So they're going through the bunkers, and the pilot of the C-130, Lieutenant Colonel Van Cleef, called into the airborne command post and said, "I've picked up the last of the survivors at Camp Duck." And when he reported that, the airborne command post gave the order, "Okay, I want the fighters to come in to burn the camp so that the facilities there will not fall into the hands of the North Vietnamese." Well, when he called in the fighters to do that, Colonel Van Cleef said, no, the combat control team is still on the ground. You have to hold up on that order. Well, dead silence. Seemed like for a minute at least. Then the airborne command post sent an O-1 down to take a look to see if they could draw the combat control team out of their search for survivors. And they were unable to do so. They sent down what was called a Misty Fact. It was an F-100. It was used as a forward control airplane for strikes up to the north. He was unsuccessful in locating them. They called another C-123 pilot and asked him to go down, make an approach to land to see if he could draw the combat control team out so that they could be picked up. Well, he did. By this time, my orbit is no longer to the southwest of the field, but I'm orbiting and crossing at about midway of the airport. And so I'm watching this, all of this go on, and I'm watching the C-123 coming in over the jungle. By this time, it's late in the afternoon, approaching thunderstorms, making it dark. You could see the tracers coming out of the jungle, the anti-aircraft fire coming out of the jungle. And he came in and made a pass and landed. But while on the runway, he came into a heavy crossfire from both sides of the runway, so he went around. And he'd been there a lot longer than I had, and he was low on fuel and said he didn't have enough to go back and make another pass. At about that time, right after that, the airborne command post called in the blind and said, "Is there any aircraft in the vicinity that will attempt to make a pickup?" And so I had seen what had happened, and by the way, when this C-123 landed and rolled down the runway, he did draw the combat control out of their hiding place, and they headed for the runway, and they dove into a ditch right alongside of the runway. And he described their location to the airborne command post, and I heard it, and I knew exactly. I could look out my window and see exactly where they were. I couldn't see the combat control team, but I could see their location. So we called the airborne command post and said, "Roger, we're going in." At 9,000 feet, I put on full flaps. We called it to the assault position, put the landing gear down, put props in the flat pitch, The purpose was to create as much drag as I could possibly, because I had watched this other airplane come in over the jungle, and the anti-aircraft fired it coming up after it, and I didn't want any part of that. So I decided that I was going to do a real steep turn and a 270-degree turn and land on the runway. So I started my approach, but before starting, I'd given instructions to the crew. Here's what I want you to do. Major Campbell, I want you to reconfigure the airplane for takeoff, because I'm not going to pay any attention to that. Ed Trejo, I want you to keep these engines running. Manson Grubbs, I want you to get that control team on board and let me know when they're on board so we can take off, because we're not going to waste any time. So I was the luckiest guy in the world. Even in that steep diving turn of 9,000 feet, from 9,000 feet down to airfield elevation, I was able to land the airplane in the first 100 feet of the runway, which is now reduced in length, usable length, to 2,200 feet base because of that helicopter that had been shot down and crashed in the runway. And I had told him that I am not going to reverse the reciprocating engines, because if I do, that's automatically going to shut down the jets, and I ain't going to waste any time waiting to restart the jets. So I want the jets to keep running, so I'm not going to reverse. I'm going to stop with brakes only. Well, as luck have it, I landed in the first 100 feet of the runway and was able to stop exactly opposite the three guys that was in the ditch alongside the runway. Well, I pulled up and stopped, and I cocked my airplane. I was going to turn it around so that the back end of the airplane would be pointing towards the three guys, which is off to the side of the runway. And so they jumped out of the ditch and they headed right for the front of the airplane, and I had to stop. I remember saying to Jesse, you know, I wish they wouldn't run directly towards this airplane, because I can turn it a lot faster than they can run. One of the biggest lies I ever told. Those guys were motivated. They were coming out of there. And so all I did then was to stop the airplane so that I wouldn't run over any of them or injure any of the three. And I was looking at the back end of the airplane back there to see when they got on board, and Jesse yelled out, "Oh my God, look at that!" And they had fired a 155 millimeter rocket directly at the airplane, and it had scooted down the runway, and it had broken in half, and it stopped right in front of the nose wheel. And I looked over. Oh my God, if that thing had gone off, you'd have had a different speaker today, I'll guarantee you. Because it was practically right under the nose wheel when it came to a stop. I didn't see it coming because I was looking in the back. They hopped on board, and I saw them get on board, and so I started applying power. Jesse, his job was to run up the jets, and which he did, and he said, "Let's get the hell out of here." I said, "Okay, I'm on my way." So I got off the ground using the jets of the K model, and started a steep climb. By that time, it's almost dark, and we could see the tracers coming towards the airplane. If you've ever been really scared, you can think of how scared you must have been at a time like this. At any rate, we climbed on out and got up above the range of the anti-aircraft fire and headed on back to Da Nang. Now, I want to show you a photograph that was made at the time that my airplane was on the ground. I don't know who made it. I think it was made by a reconnaissance airplane, but it shows you graphically what it was kind of like at Cam Duck. This is the airfield, and right about somewhere in here is my airplane. Right across the runway in this area, somewhere, I'm sorry, I can't see it, is the old helicopter that had been shot down. On the other side, right over here, was another helicopter. It was flown by Danny Shoplock, and his crew of the helicopter all got out okay. Here is a C-130 that landed with the 4 engines disabled, and he ran through the wreckage of that helicopter up there, ran through a ditch, and that's where he ended up. Just above that, you probably be able to see the 01 that had been shot down earlier, and I have made an enlargement of the section of this photograph. Would you give me the next slide, please? This is an enlargement of it. This is my airplane on the runway. This is the wrecked helicopter on the runway. And those that can see, you'll see some black dots right out in this area that you can see 2 black dots out there. That's 2 of the guys that's running towards my airplane. The third guy was running so fast that he didn't register on the film as time went on. And as soon as they got on board, I did a 180, got off the ground, and climbed up above the anti-aircraft fire. Keith Ferris, whom most of you may recognize as a famous aviation artist, he painted a picture of what his idea was of what happened that afternoon. Next slide, please. And he sent me this copy, and he wanted me to critique it. And so I did, and I sent him back my reply, and gave him some instruction. And I said, well, you know, from the orientation of my airplane and the orientation of these other airplanes that had been shot down earlier, like the C-130 and the 01, I said, it doesn't balance out. He said, they're on the other side of the airplane. And so in discussion, he said, well, if you're gonna make a painting like this and you want to show all of the action, you sort of have to take artistic liberties with what you do. He says, as long as you can get the action in there. And I said, that's okay, Keith. It's all right with me. You take all the artistic liberty you want to, but I am not going back to pose for that picture again. Anyway, right in here is, you can see the depiction of that rocket that landed right in front of the nose wheel. Back at the beginning of World War II, there was a young man named Robert L. Scott that wrote a book about the American volunteer group that fought in China. And the title of his book was God is My Co-Pilot. And people used to say to me, you know, God must have been your co-pilot that day. And I said, yeah, it got to have been, because otherwise it would have been awfully tough. But you know, the more I thought about that, I said, no, that's not true. That's not true. Jesse Campbell was the co-pilot. I was the pilot. God was the aircraft commander. And I'm convinced that without his help, this mission could not have been a success. That is the story of the mission at Cam Duck, except for one thing. While we were en route back to Da Nang, it was getting dark. It had gotten dark. And anyway, one of the guys, I don't know which one it was, came up to the cockpit and he taps me on the arm and he says to me, man, I want to see you when you stand up. I said, what do you want to see me when I stand up for? He said, because I bet you got balls that big around. That's the story of the rescue at Cam Duck. General Westmoreland was observing all this from the operations center down in Saigon, and he turned to the Air Force component commander and he said, well, it looks like you have got another Medal of Honor in the Air Force. And General Brown took it from that, and that's when the paperwork was started. Now, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them for you. If I don't know the answer, I'll make up one, whatever suits your fancy. If you could lower these lights, please, and if you have any questions, you'll have to raise your hand and speak up, because I can't hear very well. So, any questions? Go ahead.
Mike Welch, Joe, did you pass the check ride?
I'm sorry?
Did you pass the check ride?
If you hadn't answered that question, I'd have been very disappointed. Yeah, when we got back to Da Nang to refuel and get that intelligence briefing, Jesse Campbell says, you can fly this airplane just fine. Said, this check ride is over. So the answer to the question, yes, I passed the check ride. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure.